this is Linda Carbino, and welcome to another edition of Walking Through Life. Today we're going to be talking about the tragic event from Brooke Bennett. We have with us Senator John Campbell, who is a former police officer.
Yes, former law enforcement officer, yes.
Right, and we have Robert Sand, the state's attorney. Yes.
Hi.
So you guys are going to talk a little bit about what's going on with the whole process, and a little bit about history about what happens in Vermont.
You know, Linda, first of all, I think Bobby feels the same way. We appreciate that you have us on, and I think the one thing that's so important is that everyone knows of the tragic event that occurred at the end of June, and as a result of that, the community has started asking questions of why and what could have been done, or what is being done, and unfortunately, there have been those in the national media that have had saw fit to go ahead and to try to fuel the fire and say that Vermont is just a home for pedophiles, and it's it does well when it wants to sell time or ads and space like that, but nothing could be further from the truth. And I think Bobby will agree is that it's important for us, as not only from the prosecution standpoint, but also from someone who helps create the laws and one of the architects of the recent changes in these laws. I think it's important for us to let the community know that there have been substantial changes, and the fact of where our thought process is, and the fact is that Vermont is a very safe community, and it is one that experienced a problem, but again, it's not so unique to Vermont. This is a problem all over. Unfortunately, happens across the country.
Yes.
And there's no simple answer, but I can tell you is that when you're dealing with people who can inflict the type of terror and the criminal behavior that these people exhibit, and when taking a child's life or sexually assaulting a child, they're not typical people. They're not like you or I, and they're devoid of emotion, and they are not threatened by certain things like whether they're going to go to jail or not. Because again, I believe, and Bobby, I don't know how he feels about this, but I believe a lot of these folks think that they'll never get caught.
Yeah, not only that, they don't realize the emotional scars that they may put on the children that do survive.
That's right.
It's trauma. It's bad.
And I think what's important is to understand with Michael Jakes, who was Brooke's uncle and who was the suspect in this crime. He was originally arrested, I believe, back in 1993, and I'd like if Bobby would give a perspective of what kind of laws were in effect at that time and why he may have had his probation cut short.
Could you fill us in with that?
Sure. And I guess picking up on what John has said, there's probably no other area of the criminal law that has undergone more change, more revision, and more strengthening than the area of sexual abuse. And we have come a really long way in this state in strengthening our laws. And so I reject categorically any claim by anyone locally or regionally or nationally that we are somehow soft on sex offenders. That just simply isn't the case. One of the pieces of this puzzle that I think is often lost on the public is that simply because someone is charged with a crime doesn't mean they're going to be convicted, doesn't mean they're going to be sentenced. They still have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that means calling a victim to come testify in court. And not only is the original assault unbelievably traumatic, but coming into court in front of 12 strangers, a judge, the media, is horrible for folks.
It is.
So the practical reality is that cases get resolved many times without having to have a trial, in part to spare victims the trauma of that public event. So I actually don't want to get too much into details of a specific case, but it's not unusual, even with horrific facts, for someone to receive a sentence that, at least on its face, might not seem punitive enough. But you can't just look at it on its face. You have to dig deeper and look at the underlying reasons that the case resolved the way that it did.
Bob, one of the things that I think is important that when we were listening and taking testimony was not only the fact that the trauma that sometimes, obviously the victim would have to go through again, and which is really terrible is the fact that many of these victims are young children,
Exactly,
3, 4, 5 years of age, but also the fact is that there are also times when the investigative officers are not given all of the evidence, and especially in a death case, is you don't always have that concrete evidence that would be able to be used in a trial, and therefore you're going on circumstantial evidence, and so your objective there is, do you want to get a person who you believe was responsible for the crime into the system? Could you just explain how the difficulties you have from that standpoint?
So what you need to do is engage in a balance. If you take a case to trial and the jury convicts, a person tends to get more significant consequences than if they resolve the case before trial. But you also have the possibility that the jury is going to say not guilty. Approximately 50% of the sex crimes that go to jury trial result in not guilty verdicts. That means no supervision, no control, no sex offender treatment, no sex offender registry, no DNA sample to the DNA data bank. So there are many, many times when a prosecutor will say, this case might deserve, let's say, 10 years, but I need to resolve it for less time because we need the certainty of the conviction. We need to get this person into the system. We need to insist that they get treatment, that they register as a sex offender, that they provide a DNA sample. One last point, I'm sorry, Linda.
Sure.
The biggest reason we should not enact very high mandatory sentences is defendants are going to say, fine, I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to force that victim to come to court because 50% of the time I'm going to walk out of here with no consequences at all. So high mandatory sentences sound good. They are bad for victims. They are bad for public safety.
But my question is too, I mean, I don't know if this is possible at all, but you know the trauma that the victim's going through, say it's a young teen or a young adult. Isn't there a way that the law could be changed that maybe therapists could talk about the trauma, or a family member where the person that's actually feeling the trauma doesn't have to go through that? Isn't there anything?
Well, I think unfortunately, and not unfortunately, but the way our laws are, the criminal procedure and the Constitution guarantees that every witness or every person who is charged with a crime has the right to confront the people who are accusing them of that crime. And Bobby, I guess that's really where it comes in. And one of the things we're very fortunate, especially here in Windsor County, and also throughout the state, we have one of the finest victims advocacy groups. And what we have Pam Waggle here in Windsor County, who's probably one of the best, I think, in the state. But the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services, they have I think the parent group for the victims advocates within the state's attorney's office, and they work so well with the victims of crime and with their families, and they help work them through the process. But as Bobby pointed out, is that the times when you have a very vulnerable victim, a young victim, again, 3, 4, 5 years old, or somebody with a disability, an emotional or a mental disability, there's difficulties there. But then when we get into a case like the one, and again, I think it would not be fair to talk about the current case with Brooke Bennett, but if you had a child or a victim who is dead and deceased, then the police officers will have to work with the physical evidence they can find, but also then you try to get the circumstantial evidence. And one of the things that I'm now going to ask Bobby about is, because I think this is very important, is one of the areas that we felt in the past few years that we strengthened was we started what was called special investigative units. There were 2 of them, one in Chittenden County and one in St. Albans. There may be another one in Franklin. But these were specialized units that's all they did. They dealt with sexual assault cases. And I think it's really important for Bob to explain to everyone out there why these are important and what they do to help the prosecution of a case. Because if you're able to prosecute the case, if you're able to have a strong case from an evidentiary standpoint, you don't have to plea bargain. That's where we have to understand. And then after Bob talks about that, I would like to go back, if it's okay with you, Linda, to talk about the minimum mandatories that people, the Jessica's laws that everyone is discussing out on the street.
Exactly.
We tend, particularly in the wake of great tragedies, to focus on punishment. And in my experience, it isn't the duration of the punishment that deters people from committing crimes, it's the risk of being caught. And once caught, the risk of being convicted. So what I think we really need to focus on is how do we increase the number of people who get arrested for this crime, and how do we ensure that they get convicted? Well, one of the best ways to do that is through these special investigative units. A dedicated, multidisciplinary team whose focus and whose expertise is on the investigation, the prosecution, the support services for sexual assault cases. And the legislature, to its credit, recognized the value of the model and has mandated that by 2009, every community in this state have access to a special investigative unit.
One of the things I was so surprised about, and 3 years ago, I chaired a committee to look at the sexual assault laws that we have and some other areas involving these units, and also something called civil confinement, which we may have a time to get to. And I was just really, and also this summer, having dealt with sexual assault nurse examiners, who are specialized nurses that examine victims of sexual assault. And I was just absolutely shocked about some of the things that occurred. Now, back when I was a police officer, which was many years ago, in Florida, when there was a crime that occurred, whether it be a sexual assault or something, whether it be a minor or anyone, the initial officer on the scene would start taking the report and talk to the victim. That was all well and good, except for the fact that you're really looking at it from, I think, from a prosecutorial standpoint, the officers without any specialized training don't know exactly how to get the information that they need to get out, number one. And sometimes because it's so visceral, the crime itself, and you just have this sickening feeling in your stomach when you see a young child, 5, 6 years old, who had been raped by an adult, that you want to try to help out as much as you can. It's just a human instinct. So in doing so, there are times inadvertently where you'll lead the witness, and and in doing so, you corrupt the evidence. So when I go as a law enforcement officer, I present my case to the state's attorney. The state's attorney says, well, great, except for you have this problem here because you were basically telling the witness what to say, and that type of evidence would be thrown out or suppressed by a court, and I believe it does happen quite a bit.
There absolutely is a special skill set that applies to working these kinds of cases. And it's unfair to expect a police officer to do a DUI case 1 minute, a bad check case the next minute, a vandalism case the next, and then a child sexual abuse case. It requires a special set of skills. And so I think we have an obligation to all Vermonters to make sure that officers, detectives with these specialized skills are available throughout the state.
And in fact, before we came on tonight, this afternoon, Bob and I had a conversation and he had pointed out to me, because we were talking, well, we know we've strengthened the laws, we've strengthened the sex offender registry here. Things have changed since 3 years ago in a positive fashion. But the one thing, and we're trying to find out, unfortunately, we all know we're in tough financial times, and we're cutting programs, one program after another. The one area that I feel very strongly about that we cannot turn our back on, and unfortunately the current administration has done that, is in the field of law enforcement. With the special investigative units, it's great to say, let's create them. They get up there and say, we're going to create them. But unless you take the time and the effort and you put it into a budget, and you are willing to put money into those programs, we're not going to be able to hire the personnel. And so one of the things that I had heard was not just the fact that the governor's saying, well, we don't have the money to put into these programs, but we don't have the manpower. We don't have enough officers on the street. We do have a lack of police officers, unfortunately, which is we could have a whole other program on that.
Oh, yeah.
However, what Bob had pointed out to me, which was something really important, is that and I'm going to let him put it in his words, but the state police have a number of organizations within their public safety department. But if you look to see, do they have a special unit for sexual assault crimes? The answer is no. Bob, if you could address that.
So the state police, to their credit, recognize that there are different types of crimes that require expertise. So there's a drug task force. There's a special marijuana eradication team. There's a search and rescue team. There's an arson team. There's a hostage negotiation team. There's a SWAT team. There's special DUI, drunk driving teams. So we have all these specialized groups within the Department of Public Safety, the state police. But we don't have specialized teams for sex crimes. And it seems to me that given how unbelievably devastating these crimes are on victims and on communities, that the time has come, whether through more money or just through a reallocation of existing resources, that we create these specialized teams throughout the state of Vermont.
And one of the issues that was important to you,
Right,
Linda,
right.
we talked about was the internet.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Now here's a perfect example of if we had a specialized team, what we could do. New Hampshire has got, actually, I believe he's considered to be one of the top experts in the country dealing with the internet and the luring on the internet. And back when we were kids growing up, basically you'd found your pedophiles or your child molesters. These were people who were hanging around maybe schoolyards or the local downtowns, and they would use dogs and cats and other luring type of things. Well, now they don't have to leave the comfort of their home because they have it right in front of them.
Exactly, yeah.
They have a computer, and they
And
can
this
be.
is how they lure the kids.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
I've heard so much. And we were talking about the program that Dateline had, Predator Rose, and you wouldn't believe the people that would just show up.
Right.
And you got to sit back and wonder how many of the, because it's not just where Dateline is, it's everywhere.
Right.
I mean, if Dateline come here, I'm sure they could find a number of them.
And that's why what Bobby was pointing out, if we go ahead and are able to allocate resources within the state police or within the law enforcement community to basically do what Dateline does, set up these stings or find out who is luring children. Because let's face it, to be honest with you, we're not going to be able to stop the internet. We're not going to be able to stop children's use of computers. That's another issue again for parents. Parents have a responsibility to also monitor what's going on with their children, but they can't do it all the time. Let's be realistic. I've got 3 children, and I can tell you, as much as and hard as I tried to make sure that they weren't going to spots they shouldn't have been, I assure you that my 2 boys found some interesting spots. However, when it comes down to luring, there are techniques, as I said about the gentleman over in New Hampshire, the law enforcement officer over there, and I wish I remembered his name, but who's done a fine job with exposing these pet predators online. And I think that would be a very good way and a very positive step for us to continue. And especially, as you know, in Brook Bennett, the computer is still a question of how much was involved there.
I just wanted to make one comment, if I could, concerning, the family members of the victims. Of the children that are being victimized. I mean, you can imagine what kind of mental stress that might have on a family member. Hey, this just happened to my child. What am I going to do? And I think there should be help for family members too, because I'm sure that can be devastating.
One of the things that our Child Advocacy Center up in Norwich does, and it's part of our SIU, is provide services for the entire family.
Oh, great.
Because the ripple effect, I mean, the court system just sees one little piece of it. The ripple effect is really extraordinary. So when we talk about SIUs, it isn't just the investigative piece, although that's really important, but it is also family support services for the immediate victim, but also for the family members.
And that's so important.
Yeah, and you look at a community like Randolph right now, what they're going through, and the other children that knew Brooke or knew the other young lady that's another victim here. These are things they're going to live with for their entire life, and I can't help to think that some of those children are saying, "Where were the adults?
Yeah.
Where was the rest of the members of my community when this was going on? How come they weren't there to protect us. Well, you know, it's easy to think about, and your heart goes out to them, but sometimes there are things that, because of our lives, that we are just so busy that things go right by us. We don't notice it. And so I think we as a community are also obligated to start opening our eyes. And when we find something, and when something just doesn't seem right, don't worry about, you know, picking up the phone and calling, you know, someone, an agency, and saying, this just doesn't seem right. You have to do it, even if you think that, you know, you don't want to be a pest, or you don't want to sound like you're somebody who's just trying to spread rumors. When it comes to children and their safety, you can't sit back.
No. And children give signals. They, you know, they give the signs. You know, they need the adults to say, hey, you know, let's sit down, let's talk. You know, and we are their saviors. You know. We are their knights in shining armor, and we don't need to break that. We need to be there for them. Yeah. You know, every single one of us, everyone in the community and everywhere else, we need to be there for the children. Whether it's our own or somebody else's, we need to just embrace them.